It was a Friday, and I managed to leave the hangar earlier than usual. The guys had personal errands to run, and after that, they'd probably head out since I wasn't sticking around. I was already excited for the evening ahead with my wonderful wife, Zoe. We'd known each other for nearly 6 years and had been married for 3.5. We were both 29 years old. Lately, things between us had felt a little off. Our closeness had slowed down, and for the past month or so, she'd seemed preoccupied. I figured it was time to make the evening unforgettable. I picked up a couple of bottles of good wine, 2 ribeye steaks fresh from the butcher, and roses from the florist instead of grabbing some from the grocery store. My plan was simple. Light some candles, set the mood, and hopefully figure out what had been weighing on her. I wanted to remind her how much she meant to me and, if things went well, have an early, cozy night together. I got home much earlier than she did and made sure everything was perfect. I tidied up, put fresh sheets on the bed, and placed candles in the bedroom to set a warm ambience. In the kitchen, I set the table with our nicest silverware and cloth napkins, something we usually saved for special occasions. I opened one of the wine bottles so it could breathe and put the roses by the front door, so she'd be greeted by their scent as soon as she walked in. Roses were her favorite. Then I got started on my signature scalloped potatoes. I thinly sliced the potatoes and arranged them on a tray, drizzled them with olive oil, sprinkled a little salt, pepper, and rosemary, and topped it all off with a bit of mustard powder to give the steaks a subtle but delicious kick. The house smelled amazing, and I couldn't help but smile, proud of how everything had come together. Now, all I had to do was wait for the love of my life to arrive, so I could sweep her off her feet and remind her how much I adored her. I hoped this magical feeling would carry us through the entire weekend. Just as I was placing the last layer of potato slices onto the baking sheet and waiting for the oven to finish preheating, I heard the front door open. Her voice called out, "Richard, are you home?" I frowned, puzzled. My car was parked right out front, and the bouquet of roses should have been a dead giveaway that I was inside. As I added the final sprinkle of rosemary, I heard her speak again, but this time, she wasn't talking to me. "All right, we got here first. Let's sit on the couch. It'll look less awkward if we're sitting and he's standing. He won't be as startled when we tell him." "Tell me what?" I wondered, my stomach dropping. Wiping my hands, I stepped into the living room, where I was greeted by the sight of Zoe sitting there, next to another man. I froze, my heart pounding. I recognized him immediately. He was the new deputy head of HR Zoe had mentioned a few times over the past couple of months. Tall, fit, blonde, and good-looking in a cocky, arrogant sort of way. He greeted me with a grin and stretched out his hand. "Hey Dick, I'm Gerald." Still in a daze, I reached out and shook his hand, though he practically crushed it in his grip. What a jerk. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what was happening. Zoe cleared her throat and spoke up. "Richard, we need to talk." Talk? Was he staying for dinner? I could always defrost another steak if he was. Then she dropped the bombshell. "I'm spending the weekend with Gerald. Just this weekend. It's only one time." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "What?" Gerald stepped forward with a smug expression. "Relax, this will be good for you. I'm going to teach her things you've only dreamed of. Trust me, you'll appreciate being with her more after this. She'll come back to you better than ever. And after this weekend, she'll never stray again." My shock began to shift into something else. Rage. I clenched my fists, my mind racing. If she does, I'll divorce her. Gerald sauntered up, standing way too close. He leaned down and spoke in a low, menacing voice. "No, you won't. You won't stop me." His tone sent a chill down my spine. "And if you even think about filing for divorce, I promise you'll regret it. Every step you take will remind you of this day." Then, just like that, his expression shifted. He smiled, stepped back, and continued in a normal voice. "But don't worry. After this weekend, she'll be loyal to you forever. Right, sweetheart?" He looked at Zoe like this whole thing was some kind of joke. I was speechless, trying to make sense of everything. My voice cracked as I asked the question that had been gnawing at me. "Have you already been together?" Zoe's eyes widened. "No, of course not. That would be cheating." I stared at her, disbelief written all over my face. "And this isn't?" her response. She got up and said, "I'll grab you a beer." She offered to grab me a beer, but I growled back, "I think I can handle that myself." I wasn't about to let her pretend everything was normal. Gerald placed his hand on her shoulder like some kind of possessive fool. "Give him a minute, sweetheart. He needs time to process this. We've been talking about it for weeks, and we just dropped it on him all at once. He'll come around, they always do." His tone was so smug it made my blood boil. It was obvious this wasn't his first rodeo. I stormed into the kitchen, trying to keep myself from losing it completely. I had a feeling Zoe wanted to follow me, but Gerald kept her in place. Honestly, at that moment it was probably a smart move. Still, hearing him call her sweetheart made my skin crawl. What an arrogant idiot. When I reached the kitchen, my eyes landed on the open bottle of wine. I poured myself a glass and took a long gulp. But after a second, I set it down, shaking my head. Wine wasn't the drink for a situation like this. I needed something stronger. I headed straight to the garage where I kept my beer fridge. I practically tore the door off its hinges as I grabbed a bottle of my favorite brew, Crafty Old Hen. I slammed the fridge shut and muttered under my breath, "What a couple of damn fools." I reached for the bottle opener but quickly realized it wasn't there. Of course, it must have still been in the kitchen. There was no way I was heading back inside until I got my head straight. So I went with what we'd learned back in the army. I pressed the bottle cap against the sharp edge of the workbench and gave it a solid smack. Just like old times, the cap flew off and bounced into the corner. I didn't even care where it landed. As I stood there taking a few swigs, my thoughts began to settle. I knew I couldn't charge in there blind. I needed a plan. Slowly, an idea started forming in my mind. I walked to the other side of the garage, opened a cabinet, and grabbed something I'd tucked away a long time ago. I slid it into the back pocket of my jeans. After finishing the beer in one long gulp, I grabbed another bottle and returned to the kitchen. This time, I opened it the proper way with an opener because I wanted to stay calm and collected. Then I made one more move. I slid the biggest knife from the block and tucked it into the back of my pants, right next to the other item. It wasn't for violence. I had no intention of landing myself in jail, but the show of force mattered. I had to project control. I took a deep breath and walked back into the living room. There they were, sitting on my couch, holding hands like some ridiculous Hallmark couple. As soon as they saw me, they let go and scooted apart like guilty teenagers caught sneaking out. Good. The balance of power had shifted, even if just a little. I walked over, pulled out my phone, and set it on the coffee table for them to see. The screen was on, and it was pretty obvious I'd been recording everything. Gerald stood up, spreading his arms in that condescending way. "Listen, buddy. It's just one weekend." "Buddy?" I felt a fresh wave of anger. He wasn't my buddy, not even close. He glanced at the phone and smirked. "I think you're recording this. That's fine, but if you post this on social media, you won't just feel embarrassed. You'll feel real pain. Think broken legs, permanent pain. You get me?" I crossed my arms and looked him dead in the eye. "I'm recording this for my protection, and, strangely enough, for yours too. And hers." Gerald's smile faltered for a second before he recovered. "Don't even think about sending this to my workplace," he warned. "I'm the deputy head of HR, remember? Every complaint runs through me, and I've got friends who'll keep me in the loop if anyone tries to go around me. It's not what you know, it's who you know." I nodded, keeping my face serious. "I understand, but I have a proposal for how we're going to handle this." His arrogant grin returned, and he gestured toward the phone. "Go ahead, for the record. What's your big plan?" I stared at him and spoke slowly. "First, tell me exactly what you plan to do with my wife." He puffed up his chest like he was God's gift to women. "I'm taking your wife away for the weekend to give her an experience she's never had before. She'll learn things that'll blow your mind. When she comes back, she'll be ready to give you the pleasure you've been missing." He smirked and added, "Though, to be honest, she probably won't be able to walk straight until the weekend after." He chuckled, clearly amused by his own nonsense. I didn't buy a single word of it, but I kept my cool. "And after that? What happens then?" He leaned back and folded his arms, still full of himself. She comes home to you, having had the best time of her life, and she's promised me she'll be faithful to you for the rest of her days. Trust me, she'll have some new tricks that'll drive you crazy. I turned to Zoe, who'd been quiet through most of this insanity. Zoe, is this really what you want? Her eyes welled up with tears, and she whispered, Please, Richard, it's just one weekend. After that, I promise I'll be faithful to you, she whispered. I turned to Gerald and narrowed my eyes. And what if she doesn't keep her promises? Just like she promised to be faithful to me on our wedding day, what then? What if she cheats again? Will you come back and torment her the way you've threatened to torment me? Or what if some god of sex shows up and offers her an even better time? My voice was dripping with sarcasm, but Gerald didn't seem to catch it. He blinked, looking genuinely confused, like no one had ever challenged him with that kind of question before. She promised me she'll stay loyal to you after this weekend, he said, as if that meant anything. I snorted. Yeah, because I believe every word she says right now. I crossed my arms and took a step forward. Here's the deal. I'll fight you for her. Gerald's smirk deepened. He was a bit taller, broader in the shoulders, and maybe a couple of years younger. But none of that intimidated me. His arrogance was practically leaking out of him. If that's what you want, he shrugged. Let's do it. I don't want to waste the weekend, so let's settle this here and now. I'm in, I replied without hesitation. Zoe gasped, pressing her palms to her mouth like she always did when she was nervous. But there was something else. A flicker of excitement in her eyes. Two men fighting over me. How thrilling. It made me sick. I locked eyes with her and growled. I'm not fighting for you. You're not worth it. I'm fighting for my self-respect. The spark in her eyes died, replaced by something far more serious. I turned to Gerald. If I win, you leave, and I mean for good. You don't speak to her again, not even at work. If you win, you get your weekend, and I won't file for divorce. But there are rules. He raised an eyebrow, still looking smug. All right, let's hear them. The first one to fall on his back loses. No knives, no weapons. Everything else? Fair game. And whoever wins, no cops. You good with that? He laughed. No police? Fine by me. But, you sure you don't have any knives? At that, I reached behind my back and pulled out the massive 30-centimeter butcher's knife I'd stashed earlier. I placed it on the coffee table with a heavy thunk. His eyes widened slightly. Guess you've got a gun too, huh? He asked, still smirking. I smiled and pulled out the air pistol, a near-perfect replica of a real combat pistol. I didn't know if he was familiar with guns, but anyone would have assumed this one was real when I brandished it. His bravado dimmed just a little, though he was still trying to look cocky. I'm going to beat the hell out of you, he sneered. And then put you flat on your back. Do your worst, you idiot. I shot back. But remember the rules, no knives, no weapons, and no cops. Everything else? Fair game. He leaned forward, eyes glinting with anger. I get it. And when I'm done, I might just keep her for the whole week. I clenched my jaw but stayed calm. If you win, at least I'll respect myself for trying to defend my marriage. I won't feel ashamed every time I look in the mirror. That's when Zoe's demeanor shifted. She must have recognized that determined look in my eyes, the same look I'd had in the past when things got serious. She finally realized that this wasn't going to play out the way she'd imagined. No, please stop, she cried. I've changed my mind. Richard, don't do this. Please, Gerald, leave. I don't want this anymore. Her voice trembled as tears streamed down her face, but I wasn't having it. I growled, Too late, sweetheart. You started this weeks ago when you got involved with him. Now I'm going to finish it. Right here, right now. She sobbed helplessly as I motioned toward the kitchen door. After you, I said to Gerald. He squared his shoulders and walked through the kitchen, heading toward the back door. I followed, grabbing a few items I'd prepared earlier. The second he stepped outside, I moved fast, kicking him hard in the back. He went flying forward and landed face first in the flower bed. He scrambled to his feet, eyes blazing with rage. I smiled calmly and said, "No rules." Not entirely true, but he got the point. And just as I'd hoped, it infuriated him. The power dynamic shifted even further in my favor. He charged at me, swinging his right fist. It was such a slow, telegraphed punch that I almost laughed. I easily blocked it, then reached into my right hand and threw a handful of salt, pepper, rosemary, and mustard powder straight into his face. He let out a strangled scream and clutched his face, stumbling backward. Tears streamed from his eyes, and snot ran from his nose. I rushed forward, aiming to push him onto his back, but he managed to stay upright, staggering as he wiped at his eyes. Taking advantage of his vulnerable state, I punched him square in the stomach as hard as I could. He doubled over with a painful grunt but still didn't fall. His mistake was trying to hold everything at once, his stomach with one hand, his face with the other. That's when I kneed him in the groin with every ounce of strength I had. He let out a choking noise and collapsed onto his knees, retching from the pain. He didn't have enough hands to cover all the places that hurt. Gerald was holding on to everything that hurt, trying to keep himself steady. I shoved him hard, aiming to knock him onto his back, but he resisted, so I punched him square in the face. He wobbled on his knees, but somehow he still didn't topple over. My next punch landed right on his nose, and blood sprayed everywhere. Damn, that had to hurt. You never really grasp the intensity of that kind of pain when you see it on TV. It's way more brutal in real life. Out of sheer frustration, I slapped him across the face with my open hand. His head snapped to the side. Then, for some dumb reason, I hit him again with the back of my hand. My hand exploded in pain. What an idiot move. Leaning in close, I whispered, "You can end this right now. All you have to do is lie on your back." I raised my hand again, ready to strike. His legs gave out, and he crumpled onto his side before finally rolling over onto his back. And just like that, the balance of power had completely shifted in my favor. I glanced at Zoe. Her face was wet with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were for me, for him, or for herself. Grabbing Gerald by the hair, I yanked him to his feet. I wasn't gentle about it. I dragged him to the garden gate, opened it and growled, "Remember this, you will never speak to her again, coward. And if the police show up at my door, trust me, this beating will seem like a warm-up." I shoved him out of the gate and slammed it shut. The sour stench hit me then. He'd soiled himself. Pathetic. Zoe was still standing there, phone in hand, recording everything. I walked past her toward the kitchen sink and muttered, "Send me a copy of that video." I scrubbed my hands clean, noticing how the smell of rosemary lingered. Probably from what I'd thrown at Gerald earlier. Well, at least he'll smell fancy on his walk of shame. Zoe followed me as I made my way upstairs. I went into the spare room and grabbed a suitcase. Opening her drawer, I started packing her underwear and clothes without saying a word. Her voice wavered as she asked, "What are you doing?" "I'm still yours." She stood there watching me, bewildered. I zipped the suitcase and said, "We agreed that I wouldn't divorce you if I lost. But I didn't lose, I won. And that means I'm divorcing you. You can go stay with your parents." I carried the suitcase downstairs, opened the front door, and tossed it onto the porch. Then, I picked up my phone and dialed her mother's number. "Hello, Richard. What a pleasant surprise. What can I do for you?" "Mary, could you come pick up your daughter? I'm divorcing her." Without waiting for a response, I hung up the phone and sent her the audio recording of Gerald bragging about how he was planning to spend the weekend with Zoe, and the part where she'd confirmed that's exactly what she wanted. Then, I shut off my phone. No more calls, no more excuses. I grabbed Zoe by the hand, led her outside, and locked the door behind her. She pounded on the door for a while, but I ignored it. Eventually, the knocking stopped. I half expected the police to show up at some point, but they never did. Maybe Gerald was too humiliated to admit he'd been beaten by someone smaller than him. Either way, it didn't matter. I spent Saturday sorting through all of Zoe's belongings and doing some financial calculations. The house had originally belonged to my grandparents, and after they passed, it was left to me and my sister. I'd taken out a small mortgage to buy out her half. I knew I'd probably need to reimburse Zoe for her portion of the mortgage payments, but I was fine with that. Once I finished packing her things, I edited the video and audio clips and sent them to every email address I could find at Zoe's workplace. People like Gerald always make enemies somewhere along the way, and I knew those enemies would make sure the recordings reached the head of HR. By Sunday morning, Zoe's father arrived to collect the rest of her things. He looked worn down as he stood in the doorway and asked quietly, "Is there any way that you could?" But whatever he'd meant to say died in his throat when he saw my face. He knew the answer before he even finished his thought. We shook hands, and he left without another word. I had a feeling Zoe's parents were the reason the divorce proceedings went as smoothly as they did. It's been a little over 4 months since I filed for divorce. One Saturday afternoon, I was out in the garage cleaning my air pistols in preparation for a shooting competition the next day. The doorbell rang, and I was about to get up when I heard a familiar voice call out, "It's okay. I'll get it." It was Clara, the woman who helps keep the house in order. A moment later, she appeared in the garage doorway. "There's a lady at the door," she said, glancing at me. "She says she's your wife. About 170 centimeters tall, blonde, early 30s, maybe a bit older. I've put the kettle on and left her in the living room." I wiped my hands and made my way to the living room. It was Zoe. She'd put effort into her appearance. Her makeup was neat, her clothes well chosen, but something was different. She looked older, worn out. It was the first time I'd seen her since I kicked her out. I crossed my arms and asked flatly, "What do you want?" "I'm already paying you the agreed amount for your share of the house." Her eyes filled with tears. "Richard, I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. He convinced me. He promised me everything would be okay. He told me that if you really loved me, you'd let me go through with it. He sounded so convincing," Zoe said softly. "He even brought in one of the women at work to tell me how it all worked out for her." I arched an eyebrow. "Is that other woman still married?" Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I don't know. I don't work there anymore. After the video and audio recordings went around, I was so ashamed. No one wanted to speak to me. I had to quit." I took a breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. "I need to know. Are you still seeing Gerald?" She shook her head quickly. "No. I never intended to. He kept his side of the deal. He never spoke to me again after that night. But he didn't last long at work. He missed a few days, and by then, everything had unraveled. They kicked him out of the building. Rumor has it another husband beat him up." I nodded. "It wasn't me. When I dragged him to the back gate, I gave him fair warning. But after that, I kept an eye over my shoulder for a while, just in case." Zoe's voice wavered. "Serves him right. He wasn't a decent man. Decent men don't sleep with other people's wives." She leaned forward, her eyes searching mine. "Please, Richard, can we try again? I'll never do anything so stupid again. I swear I love you. I thought I was doing something good for us, but I see now how wrong I was. I'm so sorry." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. At that moment, Clara walked in carrying a tray with cups, saucers, a teapot, a milk jug, and a plate of biscuits. She set it down carefully on the coffee table. "You'll want to let it steep for a bit," she said cheerfully before slipping back into the kitchen. Zoe's eyes followed Clara as she left. "Or, have you already found someone to replace me?" she asked, her voice low. "That's Clara," I said, pouring myself some tea. "She comes by once a week to clean. She's also one of the cleaners at the hangar. I've been so busy with work that I needed the extra help. And I had to take out an additional mortgage just to pay you off." Her gaze dropped to her lap as she whispered, "Is there any chance? Please, Richard?" I took a sip of the tea. It was weak. I should have waited, just like Clara had suggested. I set the cup down. "It's been almost 4 months, Zoe. I haven't heard a single word from you. You didn't even contest the divorce. So why now?" She swallowed hard, still staring at her knees. "I know I made a terrible mistake. I wanted to give you time. I thought Maybe you'd miss me. And I needed to build up the courage. She paused. My mom said that if you loved me, you'd give me another chance. My dad said I'm wasting my time, but I had to try. Clara reappeared with a tray of cleaning supplies and gave a small smile as she passed us. I'm just heading upstairs to tidy up. There's nothing in your room I shouldn't see, right? She chuckled. Hope you've put away all the bondage gear. Before I could respond, she darted up the stairs with a laugh. Zoe blinked, stunned by Clara's joke. I shrugged. That's her sense of humor. And no, we never had anything like that. Maybe we should have. But you never wanted to try anything out of the ordinary. Except with him. My voice hardened. Even something as simple as doggy style was too much for you. Zoe opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. You blindsided me, Zoe. You planned this for weeks and then gave me 2 minutes to react. You threatened me with violence by letting him take control. You got excited at the thought of 2 men fighting over you. You wanted him to win, so you could have your wild weekend of sex, and then waltz back into our marriage like nothing had changed. I paused, my voice low and bitter. But for me, that would have been the new normal. And in your mind, I never would have measured up to him after that. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, I was excited at first, but when you pulled out that knife and the air gun, I realized I'd made a horrible mistake. I knew then that Gerald could never beat you. I was terrified that you'd go to jail because of something I caused. I'm so sorry, Richard. I shook my head slowly. Zoe, I loved you with all my heart. But you killed that love the moment you told me you wanted to spend the weekend with him. She sobbed quietly, and I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. For weeks you'd been distant, quiet. And I thought something was wrong. I tried everything I could to cheer you up. Now I know the truth, you were planning to sleep with that jerk. I had a special dinner planned, with flowers and candles. I was right there with you, ready to listen, to love you. But you chose him. Instead of coming to me, you listened to that scumbag and let him convince you. You didn't even ask for my opinion, you turned it into a done deal, backing me into a corner with the threat of violence. I paused, staring at her tear-streaked face. How could you do that to someone you claim to love? I'll never be able to trust you again. Just being near you hurts. She hadn't even touched her tea. I took a deep breath and spoke softly but firmly. It's time for you to go. Zoe stood slowly, her movements heavy with resignation, and headed for the front door. I followed and opened it for her. She lingered for a moment, looking at me with sorrowful eyes. I love you, she whispered. I'm really sorry, but I understand. As she stepped outside, I called after her one last time. Remember that girl who told you about Gerald? Karen Prescott. Zoe stopped and glanced over her shoulder. Yeah. Karen Prescott. She's about to become Karen Jones again. Her husband's making her take back her maiden name. That hit her hard. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, and walked away without another word. I didn't watch where she went. I just shut the door quietly behind her. My mind drifted to Clara. I wondered how she was doing upstairs. I headed up the steps and noticed that my bedroom door was slightly open. Walking in, I unbuttoned my shirt and tossed it onto the floor. Clara would probably scold me for that later, but I didn't care. As I stepped further into the room, I froze. Clara was lying on my bed, the blanket pulled back, wearing black stockings and a mischievous smile. I couldn't find any bondage gear, she teased. I chuckled and shook my head. That's because I don't have any. She tilted her head playfully. Pity. I would have liked to try it. By that point, I was down to just my underwear. I walked to the bathroom, grabbed the belt from my robe, and returned to the bedroom. This should do, I said, holding it up. Clara's eyes lit up as she jumped up, spun around, and put her hands behind her back. I tied her wrists gently but securely and laid her down on the bed. Then, I slipped my head between her stocking-clad thighs, making her gasp. Almost an hour later, Clara was resting her head against my shoulder, her body relaxed and warm against mine. One of her legs, still in that black stocking, was draped over mine. She looked up at me with a contented smile. I should probably thank Zoe, she murmured. But I can't bring myself to be grateful for the pain she put you through. Thanking her would feel like excusing what she did. She smiled softly and added, when the divorce is finalized and I move in permanently, we're definitely trying that tying up thing again. That last part caught me off guard. It was the first time I'd heard her mention moving in for good. But I didn't object. The idea felt right. As we drifted off to sleep, Clara's voice was a quiet murmur. I want to learn everything Zoe never did. Her words lingered in the air as we both fell into a peaceful, undisturbed sleep.